This is the second in this series of talks, and they are based on my books, Reflexive Methodology, Constructing Research Questions, and this is what I will talk about today, constructing research questions, doing interesting research. Sounds a bit pretentious, but that's possible, and there are some tricks or frameworks one can use there. And then next time in 2 weeks, I will talk about how you can use fieldwork experience, empirical material, and to generate some new and interesting ideas. And that is the methodology of mystery creation. So to summarize, 3 parts of all this: reflexivity in general, which I talked about 2 weeks ago, and there will be there is a version on YouTube available if people are interested in that. And then today, challenging assumptions, and then the third presentation is then searching and solving mysteries. And in case somebody is interested in getting hold of these books, then a few words from our sponsor, Sage. They give 25% discount if one is using then this code here, UK21 author. So if you go to Sage homepage and then you order these books, or I think other books of Sage as well, I shouldn't say that perhaps, but then you get, and you use this code there, then you can get a discount. So enough of commercials here, and then over to the topic of today. I hope you can hear me clearly. And yes. See the slides?
Yes, we can see the slides.
Good. So the topic here is then to do interesting research through challenging assumptions. And through that, you come up with research questions that are not so predictable or boring as often is the case. I've always been struck by the lack of imagination of so much research. People tend to be quite conventional, and then there's a lot of established ideas around whatever innovation and management and leadership and strategy and branding and so on, and that's taken on board. And then you become the author number 25,500 using institutional theory or whatever. And that's fine, but we could perhaps sometimes be a bit more interesting. And of course, there are different objectives in research. Sometimes we are interested in describing, finding out something. This is the situation here and here. So many of these entrepreneurs, they're having difficulties with that, and now we make a description of that, and that's kind of good. Or we may be interested in explaining something. How come that there are so many failures in startups or whatever? Or explaining why that kind of leadership style tends to be a bit more successful in reducing whatever, or increasing whatever. Or we are maybe interested in theory testing. Does authentic leadership work or whatever? So we can be interested in all that. I'm rather uninterested in all that. I'm more interested in interesting research. And interesting research means that you work with ideas. And of course, ideas, they should have some empirical backup. They should be credible. But interesting ideas are not necessarily what you get full confirmation of, or you get perfect data theory match. If you get that perfect match, which you never do, but if you would do, then it's probably a relatively trivial and boring idea. So interesting research, there are 3 elements in order to make research experiences more relevant, as more kind of joyful, it's giving new insights and so on. It needs to be a new idea, something that is novel, something that people have not seen or heard many times before. That's tricky because so much has been already done in terms of research. So often then there are very few new ideas. Very little is really novel. Of course, details on the footnote adding level, there's always something that is a bit new, and you can have the idea of studying that and that, or having a particular twist on something. But a new idea that really is a bit more novel and unexpected, that is quite rare. But that is, I think, something that we really should try to work on also a bit more systematically in our projects. There's also a need to having inspiring and rich empirical material. And here, ethnographic work, thick descriptions, being out and seeing what's happening, and not only relying on questionnaires or interviewing 25 people with rather standardized, uninspirational questions. How do you work, and what's happening, what are your problems, and so on. We need to do something that is a bit more innovative and often a bit more demanding in terms of the empirical work. I normally recommend ethnographies, make observations or other in-depth approaches, but people don't do that so much anymore. Standard is more out there and interview X number of people and then summarize the results and then try to come up with a finding. It can be okay, but it's not necessarily so interesting. And the third aspect here, or criteria, is nicely crafted text that is written in a bit more creative way. Unfortunately, most people, they do formulaic writing. So you follow the formula, quite stiff, standardized, tick off the boxes, imitating other people, not so interesting necessarily. So and these are, of course, huge challenges for people to work with, and we can't necessarily reach the skies all the time, but we can work a bit more to make it more interesting, less uninteresting, and a bit more interesting. And what is then interesting? Is that not extremely subjective and varies between people? Yes, to some extent, but there are also a lot of shared characteristics behind what we see as interesting. And we know actually a bit about the background or the structure of what is interesting. And interesting here is, of course, a number of people that are reasonably well educated, they know an area reasonably well, and they still find a knowledge contribution, an idea, empirical finding, or whatever interesting. And this is something you can almost, I mean, they can see that people find it interesting. They stop yawning and they kind of say, aha, wow, that's interesting. So we can find out about this. And then there is one chap called Murray Davis 1971 here, and he did an excellent piece published in Philosophy of the Social Science, an obscure journal, where he had done a study of what do people find interesting in social research. So he looked at the large number of influential social theories and then looked, okay, what made them be seen as interesting? And then they found out that the social researcher who wants to be reasonably certain that he or she will produce an interesting theory about the subject must first be familiar with what the audience assumes to be true about the subject, and then generate a proposition which, in denying their assumption, will attract their attention. So you become familiar with what your audience, your colleagues and sophisticated professionals perhaps, they believe to be true about something. And then you are able to show that, well, not necessarily or probably not. And then if you can do this in a credible way, then people will find that's interesting because that will attract their attention. And they will remember that, and then they will use that kind of knowledge in their thinking and perhaps in the practice as well. So, and Davis starts his article like this. People believe that A theory is influential because it's true. People are wrong. A theory is influential because people find it interesting. And what is interesting is what breaks with their expectations. That will capture their attention. They will remember this. They will see that this adds to their mindset. And therefore, that theory will be influential. So data matters relatively little. It's the interestingness that is key here for successful research, at least in terms of the intellectual influence. Then you may be kind of policy maker and try to influence decision makers with technocratic knowledge. That's another matter. But here we're talking about knowledge theory that is a broader interest, and a lot of people tend to pick up. Davis then get support from some people, including Graham Astley, who published in ASQ 1985 one piece where he makes a distinction between two types of researchers: mediocre scientists, those that are unable to see beyond established paradigms because of the failure to grasp and articulate their colleagues' ground assumptions. Failure to grasp and articulate the ground assumptions. These are mediocre scientists. Then we have successful scientists. They are intuitively perverse. Always ready to question accepted worldviews and create opportunities for the critical rejection of what is taken as given by others. And intuitively perverse here, that sounds a bit odd perhaps, but people that are perverse are not normalized. They don't go for what the mainstream tend to prescribe or take for granted. So here you have like the deviation from what most people tend to think and do. And of course, always a tricky situation because deviants, it's a bit risky, but it can also be a bit interesting. So now if you accept this, ASQ is the leading journal in management studies. So we, of course, need to accept that Graham Astley wrote this, and that was probably correct. I'm joking a bit. But if we accept this, then you realize now you have an existential choice. What kind of people are you, or do you want to be? Mediocre scientists or intuitively perverse people? So that's something to think about when you are sleepless during nights and facing your demons. Am I a mediocre or a perverse person? These are, of course, two slightly negative, perhaps, options, but no such thing in life as a free lunch. There's always a disadvantage with something. So, and I do think that this needs to be considered. Now I move over to this mode. So, two modes of asking research questions. And of course, there are different modes, but if we research questions, they may be very empirically oriented, very theoretical or very intellectual. You are just interested in doing an empirical study and see what's happening out there, and that's fine. But sooner or later in all research, we need to consider what's established knowledge. What are the theories and knowledge that is there already? So even if your primary motive is not to add to or relate to theory, we still need to consider that quite seriously. So we are not inventing the wheel, or we are doing something that could be done much better if we had some closer interactions with established knowledge. So we need to consider existing theory, existing knowledge quite seriously, either as a point of departure or later in the research process, something that you need to take very seriously. And then how do you relate to existing literature, empirical studies, and then theory? And there are two major ways of doing this. One is then through gap spotting. And this is the normalized, the mediocre way of doing this, gap spotting. You identify a gap in the literature. A lot of studies, they haven't said all, there are some openings, there are some unresolved issues, problems that one need to address further or whatever. So here people are supposed to position themselves in academia in a particular way and then add to the debates or the knowledge situation in that often rather tiny area, and that's gap spotting. You find and fill a gap in the literature. And this is for most people rational and unavoidable, a must. And this is celebrated and taken for granted. It tends to either lead to under problematization, that you accept a lot of stuff and then you locate you there and you try to add to that knowledge field. Or you do micro problematizations, you just look at the nitty-gritties in terms of uncertainties and imperfections and lack of knowledge within that tiny, small sub-field that you are working on. So that is fine, and what most people do, so it must be right. The majority must be right, don't they? No, the majority is always wrong. Not always wrong, but it's an alternative assumption that mainstreaming, low level of flock immunity, they're taken on board on a lot of paradigmatic and other ideas that are just being accepted. Doesn't mean that people are wrong, but they tend to be quite uninteresting in their studies because of this, because they mainly then reproduce what we basically already know and contribute with footnote adding. So the alternative to this is problematization. And then you consider what's been done research-wise within a particular field, not too small, and then you start to ask, okay, what may be problematic, insufficient, wrong with this? What assumptions are they drawing upon that may be targeted for problematization? So that's alternative. And then based on that, you generate a research question. And here, with some luck, you can be seen as doing something that is interesting. Most people do gap spotting, they identify confusions, they identify neglect, they see applications. You may have kind of digged up a dead French philosopher who has some ideas, and you kind of plug these ideas into whatever studies of middle managers' career transition problems or stress issues or whatever, and then you see application of a particular theorist or knowledge field, or you find that there's still one area that institutional theory has not covered, and then you see an application for institutional theory to address a particular issue. So this is gap spotting. If we do gap spotting, then why do we do this? It normally doesn't lead to that much interesting, but it's easy, it's uncontroversial, it's the tradition that we should be into knowledge accumulation, and then you build positively on the work that's been conducted already, and then you find the gap, and then you try to fill it. So tradition encourages this. The journal format, you're supposed to do a literature review, 3 pages. Don't mess things up too much, but summarize the literature and then show what you like to add to this literature. Don't ask any fundamental questions about what may be wrong with all this, because in most areas there may be something that is rather problematic. Academia is a crediting economy, so you're supposed to vacuum clean the literature, and then you have a lot of references, which makes those that are being referred to, people like myself, then very happy and satisfied with the stuff. So therefore you You tend to be friendly and generous and credit a lot of people for early work. You don't say that they may be wrong with things. Our institutions, they like us to produce the right metrics. We like to be employable and promotable, and then we pump out a lot of papers. Gap spotting is a bit quick way to do this. And to be honest, it sometimes often makes sense to adopt gap spotting. It's not wrong in itself. Sometimes it makes sense. It can lead to good studies, etc. My problem, and the problem also of Jürgen Sandberg, because I say that our book, Constructing Research Questions, and then the paper in Academy Management Review 2011, was a predecessor of this. We worked on this together. And we find gap spotting is okay, but it's not the only way to do research. There are other ways. And then problematization, it's difficult, it's demanding, you need to be lucky, you need to work a bit harder, you need to be prepared to be seen as perverse by people that are very much into mainstream. Okay, so it is difficult, but it's not impossible to do it, and many more people could probably do a bit more of this and then do more interesting research. The problem is that we tend as researchers to be quite boxed into a particular worldview. There's a lot of commitments to that. We belong to research community where we have supervisors and friends and go to the same bloody conferences and then belong to a particular gang of other people sharing our peculiar interests in whatever. And we tend to identify with these folks, and I am an institutional theorist or an identity researcher or a service marketing kind of person. So we kind of constrain ourselves in our approaches, and then we are very much inclined then to look for the gaps rather than to start to question assumptions and ideas and the fundament behind what we tend to do and so on. There's also this tendency that we work within a specific set of theoretical commitments for a very long time. You exploit your knowledge, and then you tend to be very much into this narrow mindset and can't really break out of this. And then you cement your assumptions and the way that you look at things through. So a lot of people, they like to have it safe and to be constrained and to have a predictable existence, and then you don't open up the boxes. You live in an academic box and you belong to a particular academic sub-tribe. You read a particular kind of literature, talk to a particular kind of people, read certain journals, and then tend to go for publications that are often targeted mainly to people that are very similar to yourself in terms of outlet. And then don't rock the boat. Let sleeping dogs sleep, and don't start to mess around with assumptions. So we have a lot of compliance in academia, and then a lot of incremental, small footnote adding contributions. And often this is what we can expect. That can be okay, as said before, but there's a shortage of things that tend to stand out and be a bit different. And in order to do that, we need to problematize our concepts, our ideas, our assumptions about a lot of stuff. And problematization, then it's not so easy, but because you believe that these are the phenomena. And then if you open them up a bit, I mean, it's difficult to do that sometimes. People believe that they are leaders. You believe that they are leaders? Most people believe that, and they believe they are followers as well. But then you may start to, okay, what is the meaning of all this? Is this a good categorization? Where this coming from? In the past, there were not all these leaders, tyrants and bosses and other folks, but now we have this idea of leaders or leadership. And you start to kind of unpack and problematize this and look at what are the assumptions behind all the rather superficial type of reasoning that tends to dominate. So this is the systematic questioning of received wisdom. And just because others are doing something, then you can see that they must got it right. We must continue more or less along these routes. Well, you can have the opposite view. This is just an effect of institutionalization. People are mainstream. They are caught in these patterns. The cage have taken upper hand. And now we need to open this up. And I tend to assume that just because a lot of people approach phenomena in a particular way, that they got it right. No, I assume that they probably got it wrong, or they are caught in rather unhelpful assumptions that are worth considering, but they're also worth going further away from in order to create mind stretch and find other ideas and perspectives and theories on these issues. So assume that your supervisors, your colleagues, your favorite authors, they may got it wrong, partly. The chat function says 99 plus here, so I assume that that's people signed up or reported where they come from, but so I don't look at that. And here, problematization, that's quite tricky. It is difficult. It's not that just you, now I have a look and start to ask questions of what these people are into and so on. We normally need to look, where is this coming from? And when we study phenomena, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, middle managers, leadership, strategic management, branding, whatever, motivation, then we assume that it is a naturally occurring object out there. We don't realize that we have invented this, or previous generations, they have invented these phenomena, constructed them, and then we mistake them for natural reality. I mean, just such a thing as an adolescent, teenager, adolescent. You know, when the teenagers, they came about, that was in the 50s, 1950s. Then the teenager was born. And we have adolescence. And now we take it for granted. The people between 13 and 20, they are adolescents. And we take the category as given, and then believe that we can study that category in a particular way. And a lot of other things that we're into, mental health, stress, burnout, self-actualization as a motive, the middle manager, authentic leadership, human resource management, careers. I mean, a lot of this stuff that we tend to take for granted, we should not take for granted. We should ask, where are these ideas and concepts coming from? What's the basis? What assumptions are there behind then the production of this seemingly objective phenomena out there that we can kind of grab and study? So we need to ask, how come that a particular subject matter has become an object of scientific investigation? How come that a lot of people believe that there are entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship out there that we can go out and then measure or investigate or whatever? There's one category called entrepreneurs. I mean, nobody's doubting that there's some creative work done, perhaps, or people are starting businesses and so on. But the idea of entrepreneurship, but a lot of ideas and assumptions and blah, blah, can start to think about where's this coming from and so on. What are the historical and practical conditions that give birth to a particular subject matter? And what determines our current understanding of the subject matter? And these ideas about the subject matter, the objects that we try to study, where are they coming from, what determines them, and how come that we believe that objective reality out there is the trigger of our research questions? this sounds a bit abstract, but I will give you two examples. One is on strategic management. Strategic management was kind of founded then in the 50s. Before that, generals, they were into strategies, how to beat the shit out of the enemy for outflanking and different types of maneuvers. That was strategy. You have a field marshal, you have resources, troops, and so on. You have enemy, and you have a strategy in order to invade the other country or beat the enemy or whatever. And then after the Second World War, generals were popular and business started to change a bit. There were business schools, and what should they do before engineers were mainly running companies? Perhaps we have business schools, and we need to have something there. Well, a strategy. So strategic management was formed like a discipline, and then tended to lead to a lot of business people. Well, I need to do something. I need to do portfolio management or mergers, or later on the corporate competence and things like that. And then we take strategies for granted as something that is there and you have to do and blah, blah, blah. But if you look at this as Knight and Morgan did in Organization Studies, 1991, it's quite fascinating how this was kind of emerging as a particular discourse and then a practice, and the origins are a bit shaky or particular nature. But that's quite interesting to see how it kind of then emerges. The same with motivation. We tend to take motivation theories for granted, and then we can ask the question, why this interest in motivation? Well, in the 50s and early 60s, then motivation appeared as a topic, a sub-discipline, a theory. So we had Maslow and McGregor and Hertzberg and Room and other people, and they all came with their theories around late 50s and 1960, roughly. And then you can ask here, well, should I only study motivation as something of interest? Or I can ask, how come that motivation, like Maslow's rather strange pyramid of needs, it emerged as kind of knowledge and truth and so on. And Burkhard Sievers in Organization Studies, 1986, he suggested that motivation, it emerges as an academic sub-discipline when meaning is lost or weakened. So motivation is a surrogate for meaning. Well, work is inherently meaningful if you are a farmer or you are a blacksmith and you're doing something where you can see the purpose of this, because there are some people benefiting from your work output, and also you earn money so you can reduce poverty and keep starvation away. Then it's inherently meaningful. You don't ask for motivation under these circumstances. But then with increased business, mass production, large-scale bureaucracies, and so on, then work becomes much weaker in terms of meaning. You don't necessarily have to work, because even if you don't work, you probably won't starve necessarily. Could have a reasonable life without working, and you don't see the purpose. And a lot of work is totally without clear purpose, like sometimes educating management students. As one person said once when she was teaching business ethics, they were so passive and totally uninterested. Why are you here? Well, at the business school. Well, two reasons for people being there. One was to earn as much money as possible. And the second reason was, well, I don't know. And then we need to have motivation instead, because meaning is not so significant. So we have course assessments and grading, and then performance management and the metrics, and we need to have promotions and tenure and a large apparatus in order to motivate people. But the contemporary university is very strong on motivation, but meaning is lost. My first talk before the series here was based on our book, The Return to Meaning, for social science with something to say. And once upon a time, people were doing research because they had something to say. Now we are doing research because we want to get a degree, being employable, promotable, and metricsable. So you see the point here. So before we then strategy and motivation and leadership and whatever, diversity management and all other peculiar things that we're interested in, where in hell is this coming from? What's the background? What type of assumptions and context are these knowledge areas being based on? And if we start to investigate that and look at the assumptions here, then we have a chance to do something interesting, perhaps. Types of assumptions we need to consider. Some are more smaller and shared by a minor group of people. Not so interesting. We have more metaphorical assumptions, such as organizations. They are cultures, or they are brains, or theaters, or whatever. Then you can work with this. Or more broader paradigmatic or ideological assumptions, such as entrepreneurship is good, or we need leadership to make our work lives and organizations tick. Or field assumptions that academia is a good thing, we're all into kind of knowledge development or whatever. But there are different types of assumptions that we can work with. But I should not talk too long about this. Actually, should I... is there somebody want to say something? There are 300 people out there. If we haven't we've only lost 4 people. So that's, now we lost only 3 people here, fluctuate a bit. But in case one want to say something, then we could, I can catch my breath and we can hear one other voice. I mean, we'll be more space then for questions and so on later on, but if somebody wants to say something.
Mats, if I may.
Yes.
I've read your article on problematization at the beginning of my PhD journey. Still didn't manage to include your article as a reference, because each time whenever I tried to, my reviewer said, you know what, as soon as you introduce Alvesson, you say that all the stuff that you've written before is rubbish. So you're just killing yourself, you're just shooting yourself in the foot. All right, so my question is, how to strike that balance between complying to the requirements of the traditional research, all right? Because we need to read the literature and we need to prove that the research question that we are trying to do is understudied. All right. So if there is an article which done exactly the same, there is no point for us to do. And yeah, the requirement to do that research interesting, So whether there is a middle ground between problematization and filling the gaps, or we cannot marry those together.
Yes, no, I think that's a good question. And when we were mentioning your experiences here, Sergey, I looked at the number of participants, and it only dropped with 1 person. I was afraid that we will lose a large proportion of the participants here with your slightly then depressing observational experience here. But yeah, no, I think it is a dilemma. I will come back to that, but we can do problematization to different degrees. And of course, the challenge is to do this in such a way so that it's clear and innovative and understandable and reasonably acceptable for enough number of people. I mean, we can't get them all, and sometimes reviewers are a bit extra tricky because they tend to be experts, and then they have their interest, and they're quite narrow-minded. So you may write something that a lot of people find really interesting, but the selected group of reviewers, they may be rather caged in to a particular mindset or ideas. So then that is sometimes a bit extra hard to, even if you get a lot of rewards after you get the stuff out there and you get an audience. The first audience, the reviewers, may be a bit of a hurdle. But we come back to that issue. But I definitely agree that this is the dilemma. Sometimes you can be aware of reviewers beforehand. You can perhaps ask editors if they could avoid then those that are perhaps most likely to feel that they are stepped on their toes by a particular approach. So, but sometimes we just have to try. I mean, we get rejected most of the time for a variety of reasons. And one reason is it's not interesting, it's not new, and sometimes this is too provocative. And sometimes there's a balance, but sometimes if you do the balance, then it's not enough in any direction. So whatever we are doing, then we have our butts in the behind. And we are vulnerable to whatever. So but the trick here, this is like the framework. The framework for doing interesting research. And I'm a very, as you notice when you listen to me, I'm a very simple man. I like the elevator pitch. I can always present my research results in about 25 seconds. But and here the brief story of then the approach is that you do two things. You identify implicit assumptions, and then you challenge them and come up with alternative assumptions. That is what you do. And a bit more in detail then, you start your research by target a domain, not too narrow domain. It needs to be a bit broader than being very kind of selective and narrow. But of course you need to have a core domain, and then you need to look around that as well. So there's a body of literature and or a few exemplars. An exemplar is very influential central work which people relate to and kind of define the field, like Mintzberg on managerial work, or Schumpeter on entrepreneurship, or whatever. So you can look at this very carefully. And you don't do the vacuum cleaning. I mean, normally people do vacuum cleaning, they read the abstracts and then perhaps the conclusion, and then they summarize that. Well, at least some people do that sometimes. But here, vacuum cleaning is not enough. You need to read more carefully, very carefully, but you don't need to read that much. In general management studies, we have ideas for this on the critical review. So if you're interested in that, you can have a look at our piece in JMS, General Management Studies, on the critical review, how to do this. But so next step then is to identify and articulate assumptions underlying existing theory. So identify and articulate assumptions that are implicit, not spelled out, not so clear in existing theory. Okay, and this means that you are not just reading text and then telling the audience, this is what the text says. You read also what the text doesn't say, what's implicit. What are the assumptions? So, I mean, one assumption could be in leadership studies then that just fix something here, that people have an innate need for or an appreciation of leadership. That's a common implicit assumption in a lot of leadership research, but it's not there. They don't spell it out, but it's implicit, and then people tend to. You can see my home here, so you get some entertainment, some value for money. By the way, it's rather messy, but still. I move over here in order to avoid too much light. Anyway, so you need to look at the implicit, what's not being said also. Of course, you read the text, but what's behind what's being said. So assumptions, they seldom come out. In economics, they come out. We have some totally unrealistic assumptions that we proceed from. Sometimes people are optimized so their self-interest or whatever, which is perhaps not a good assumption, but still. But here we are interested in implicit, taking for granted assumptions. And these need to be identified. And in hermeneutics, what's that mean? Combine parts and whole, then I can see some implicit elements here that needs to be perhaps highlighted, and I try to articulate them, which can be a bit tricky, but that is also a bit of a challenge then to articulate these assumptions. And then when you identify them and articulate it, then you look at them with your glasses carefully and evaluate them. Do these assumptions make sense? For example, leadership. Do people have an innate need for leadership? No. I mean, sometimes under specific circumstances they may have, but something must be wrong with them if they can't kind of think and act and use colleagues or systems or networks or whatever in order to cope. So then the evaluation here is that assumption there is a bit tricky. Perhaps, and then you can start then to develop new assumptions based on your critique or questioning of existing assumptions. So you may ask, when and how do people come to believe that they have this need for leadership? How is the leader needing character being developed? I mean, these examples in the region of alternative assumptions, that something must have happened in order to produce then the leader needing person. So that the need for leadership is perhaps a social kind of process leading to certain outcomes. So, but when you have alternative assumptions, and these assumptions, you need to consider the alternative assumptions in relationship to the audience. Because you can normally not prove anything, but if you have something to say that people find interesting, then they will probably appreciate your knowledge contribution. And then, of course, they assess what's interesting. It's not because it's like up there in the blue, but in academia, interesting includes some assessment of imperial backup or usefulness or relevance in the real world. So it's not like surrealistic art or anything like that, of course, which could be interesting, but that's not what people in academia find interesting in this context. So you consider assumptions very much in relationship to the audience. What will they find interesting? This is how the audience reason around all this. If you can show that this is perhaps constrained, problematic, limiting, and then the alternatives, then the audience will hopefully consider this. And then you have the intellectual problem of getting this right, credible and clear and pedagogical, but you also have to consider the political and symbolic and economic elements in all this, because people are not just interested in supporting any kind of good idea. They may be quite hostile to ideas that are not in line with their own self-interests or intellectual laziness. And if they're too provoked, then they will always find something that's wrong. And then there is the test here, and now I should if I had a whiteboard, I should draw this, but I use my hands here like a police person directing traffic instead. So we have two dimensions. One dimension is then this here, and that is interestingness. So here you have 0 interesting, and here you have very, very interesting. Okay? And then you have another variable here, and that is the degree of assumption challenging. So here you have 0 assumption challenging. You just do the gap spotting, and then you reproduce, take for granted assumptions in a particular field, and you just reproduce that. 0 assumption. And over here you have more assumption challenging, and here you have bloody lot of assumption challenging, radical, paradigmatic kind of attacking assumption challenging. So you have more here and less here. And then you can see how these two dimensions then tend to can be combined. So if there's 0, 0, then it's here. 0 assumption challenging, 0 interestingness. Maybe other qualities, rational and reliable, and you are bright and you're diligent and so on, but you are not particularly interesting, or your knowledge contribution is not interesting. If you have some good assumption challenging, you may end up here. So with some high quality assumption challenging, people will find this is really interesting or interesting. And then you assume it will go like this, but it doesn't. It tends to go a bit like this down here. Because if you overdo assumption challenging, then sometimes it's tricky to do this if you are not a genius that really can challenge entire field. But the other problem is people are not so prepared to accept this. So when run into a lot of kind of questioning and hostility and doubts about your production. And here, as it says here on the point 6 here, you have 3 types of responses to your research. Apart from this is trustworthy, and you have been diligent and rational and clear and blah, blah, blah. But you have 3 types of major responses. One is that's obvious, and that's the position here. That's obvious. You have the position here. That's interesting. Wow, aha, that makes me think differently. Now I get something new out of the study. And here you have the response, that's absurd, that's difficult, I don't understand this, this is too much, makes me angry and a bit irritated, and it's too provocative. So people will find it perhaps a bit interesting, but not so very much. And the trick is then to follow your audience and work indirectly with your audience, so they will move from here to here. And this is what you can kind of study, and then hopefully you will be reasonably successful. And my mission here, Jörgen Sandberg's mission, is to go from, try to push some people who go from here to here, and sometimes even further. But some movement here is what I could start with, and then one should really try to not just accept the stuff, but really try to problematize this. And then you show that you are at least a bit perverse. So, and then I can give a lot of examples of this. I try to exemplify this in all my work, so hopefully there are some examples one could use in identity studies and leadership and human resource management and so on. So we should take just one example here, and then I should open up for questions and comments. I always speak for too long, sorry about that. The problem when you write books, then you have a lot to say, and then you feel a bit like a missionary. So anyway, just one example. Do you have values? That's one assumption, that we have values. And then there are tens of thousands of studies then claiming that people do have values. Values are like properties. They are like fixed traits. They are there, and you go out and then you send a questionnaire or you interview people, and then you get their values. And then you can compare values over time, career shifts, occupations, organizations, values amongst managers in the banking industry or whatever. So, but that's one assumption, and most people don't see that's not an assumption. Of course, we have values. That's a fact. It's a fact. But there are very few facts in our business. Almost all facts, they are based on assumptions, so they are much more shaky. And the idea here is not to accept so much as facts, but we compare facts and we look at assumptions rather than facts. And then one assumption, and it's okay assumption, but we consider it assumption. People have values. Values are like properties. And then a counter-assumption, which you can come up with after investigating this, that, well, people tend to be a bit more flexible. We should be team players, we should be customer-oriented, we should get along with a lot of people, we should favor diversity and blah, blah, blah. So people may not have so many values as they take, or we take value positions. Values are like processes. So sometimes we are much in favor of animal rights. Yes, value. And then at another point, we eat our big steak without considering that much the suffering that probably has preceded then what's on our plate. So we move between different processes, the processing of values. So sometimes we are in favor of integrity, and sometimes we are team players. And sometimes we are proud of our nation, and sometimes we really are not nationalists at all. So we tend to be a bit, sometimes we play the game as academics, we try to get published and get passed, and sometimes we really are serious and true intellectuals that really are deeply committed and don't see this as a game playing at all. So I'm not saying that, but an assumption is values, they are processes or discursive resources. Or there may be a third assumption here, institutionalized expectations. They are value scripts. So in academia, there are a number of kind of values that circle around. And then we use them and we tend to tie ourselves to them, but they are not necessarily our properties. It's more like social expectations that tend to govern our lives. So, and my point here, these are different assumptions. And then to be interesting, you perhaps are not doing study number 10,005 based on the idea that values, they are properties. You may come up with the idea that values are processes. And then I do a study how people are processing values, how they can move around like a pinball or a navigator on a minefield, and how people tend to do this in relationship to various groups and various interests and so on. And I do a study of that. And then if we are correct here, people find that's interesting because it's a new research question. It's a new study based on alternative assumptions, not entirely brand new, but still sufficiently new for making a lot of people hopefully think that this is a bit interesting and others to be upset because too much. Of course, people have values. Well, I say, of course, they not have values. If you have values, then you only run into problems. You should be optimistic and then move around minefields and so on. All right, so let me conclude. There are so many interesting options in terms of doing research that can be really interesting. We tend to blow it. We tend to be quite conformist and conventional and buy into a lot of established frameworks and do as others have done before us. That can be wise, and we can't totally avoid this. but sometimes we can be a bit more interesting, a bit more different, a bit stronger, energetic, bold, individualistic, a bit more flock immune, and then do more of this. I mean, we need perhaps to cultivate our perversions a bit, being a deviate, not being so normalized and well-educated as all other people are. Important here is that problematization is not about pre-programmed fault finding or bringing in something new from an alternative established framework. I think sometimes people think I'm doing problematization because I read postmodernist literature, and then now I have a go with the idea of corporate culture or career or whatever. No, that's not problematization. Problematization means that you're doing something, you're not just importing something pre-established, but you do something that is novel. You need to do the intellectual work yourself. You can get help from your friends and help from alternative literatures, but still this is a creative act. And interesting research is not just importing or reproducing what some esoteric tradition not being fully utilized have said already. So this we can do. And if you're interested, you can read our paper in Academy Management Review 2011, and this is hugely cited. So people don't see this as particular odd or strange or illegitimate. Most people see this, and a lot of major editors for major journals, they have actually referred to this kind of stuff. So people accept this. The problem is to do it well. And the problem is that sometimes you have a lot of these uncertainties in the review process and so on. So it's not easy, and the failure rate is high. But sometimes it's worth taking some risks and being a bit more energetic, and also take some conflicts with people, because sometimes it's not just that everybody likes this. It's a bit challenging, provocative, but that's how it should be. So thanks very much, Ibrat and Sergey. I don't know if we have some. Next time in 2 weeks, I will talk about mystery creation. But enough for now. And so if there are any questions or comments, or people like to express their Weltschmerz.
Thank you, Matt, for your insightful presentation. We're just going to open it for a discussion now. Before we start, may I just suggest if the following few points as we run the discussion to help us to run the discussion smoothly. I would encourage you, if you have a question, to ask the question directly. Alternatively, if you, for some reason, you can't do that, you can write your question in the chat and I can read it out. But when you ask a question, can you please raise your hand in the reactions function? That way, Zoom automatically creates a list of people and the order in which we can ask you then to pose your question to Matt. Yeah, that's all really from me. And whilst people are thinking through the question, can I just ask you, Matt, I mean, your final point was very interesting, that problematization is very difficult. Could you perhaps maybe you could give us an experience from your own example, from your own experience, how you've done it, just to give us an idea?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you get support from empirical studies. I will talk more about that next time, about mystery creation here. But also you sometimes look very carefully at the text, and then I can give you one example here, which I'm a bit happy with, and that's gender. Gender. Here we have gender. Can you see this now? Can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah. So gender, then this is the history of gender in a sense. Then at first, then people normally approach gender as biology or as psychology. So in social science, typically as a socialization effect. Gender is the fixed subjectivity of men and women because of sex roles and other things. So then you have attitudes and values and orientations and leadership behaviors, perhaps due to your biological or psychological gender. So fixed subjectivity, but that was challenged then by some sociologists like Kanter, that said that this is kind of misleading. Behind these changes in attitudes and behavioral patterns and so on, it's not psychology, it's structure. So people are located on the labor market or in organizations or have different positions in the families and so on, and that is behind this seemingly individual characteristics. So gender is about the gender system, the gender regime, or about patriarchy. It's a structural outcome rather than fixed. So that was like a type of assumptions in most of the research before this. And it started to become popular in the 70s and continued. And then West and Zimmerman, they had a piece where they said that, well, it's not the system. It's not a structural phenomena. Gender is very much something that we do. We enact gender. Gender is an interactional accomplishment. So when we are in social situations, we do something to demonstrate our genderness. We take some gender positioning or we exhibit something. So for example, if you're a female athlete and you fight like hell and you compete and you're very kind of masculine, stereotypically masculine and competitiveness and focus and a lot of things like that. But then there's this expectation one should do gender. So when there's a party after the games and so on, you dress very femininely, and if you get the medal and you perhaps cry a bit and you show your emotions, and then people will be relieved because this is still a true woman. And sometimes we do gender in order to show this. So occasionally as a female manager, you may be a bit softer or ask some questions about family, whatever, because you're supposed to do gender. So gender is something that we do rather than we are, or the structural system then imposes on us. And then Western Zimmerman's idea was that we are doomed to do gender. We have to. There are strongly institutionalized cultural expectations. So therefore we kind of feel that we need to do gender. We can't escape this without social sanctions. So therefore people tend to do gender. Not all the time, but some of the time, and enough of this. But then that was problematized, and this was partly related to social changes and so on. But the post-structuralists, Butler and others, they said we can undo gender. There is this kind of performance pressure, but we can also perform stuff in such a way so that we play around, we resist, we are ironic around gender, and therefore we can undo gender. And that's a problematization of Western Zimmerman's assumption about the doing of gender being there. And then Western Zimmerman came back and they said, well, we can't undo gender. We can redo gender. We can find new progressive forms, but still gender is there. It's a cultural must. And then we thought that, okay, now this is a real challenge because so much has been said and so much assumption challenging had been done. So we felt in our book, Constructing Research Questions, that one could perhaps look at all this and then see, is there still options to come up with alternative assumptions through problematizing earlier ones? And yes, and this led to the idea that people can also non-do gender. And this is based very much on detailed reading of various ideas and assumptions in the early literature, and then we take them. So do you pay attention to gender? Not necessarily. Is that something that you are worried about? Well, sometimes you couldn't care less, perhaps, and so on. So we are saying that there is often the option, and people, large part of the time, they are non-doing gender. They're doing something else instead. They may do age or professionalism or nationality or class or being extremely interested in stamp collection or particular other hobbies, or being fanatically interested in neo-institutional theory and how it can be used to understand changes in the cricket games, or how gay bath clubs in California are operating. People, just two topics that come to my mind here. So, and then you're not necessarily, when you're into this, doing so much gender. And when you're writing a paper or you are reviewing or whatever, then not necessarily. So the idea was that a lot of the time we are non-doing gender, perhaps. And then you can study then the non-doing of genders and see what's happening if people are doing that. And then the question is more when gender and when what. That is a good question. And some empirical support from this I came from my colleague then, Professor Barbara Czerniawska, who once said that, I hope it's okay that I'm quoting her now, when I'm at work, I like to be a professor. And when I'm at the dancing floor, I like to be a woman. The problem is that it's sometimes the other way around. But so it's more like the situatedness of all this that could be interesting to study. And I don't know it's brilliant, but that's one example. Another example that we came up with was the idea of the middle manager. And here with the middle manager, you have the idea, there's a lot of assumptions that the middle manager is in the middle. Okay? And then there are people above and there are people below. And then the middle manager is like in a sandwich position and then kind of stuck here. So it's relatively fixed, relatively permanent. It's like a state or property. But then okay, is that so? Or perhaps it's so that it's much more kind of moving in a lot of different directions. It's perhaps not a fixed state, but it's a process. And one way of then thinking about the process, it's very much up and down, up and down. So sometimes you are a senior person, you're talking to junior people. Sometimes you are a bit more junior, and then top people would like you to implement this, do this, be obedient, compliant, blah, blah, blah. And then you kind of move here like a yo-yo. So we then had the idea that the yo-yo manager with Susanne Gärde and I, that's an alternative assumption how you can grasp then the middle manager. And then you can do a study then or look on the yo-yo in operation. And then see what's happening with the strings, because a good yo-yo can move up and here, but the problem is that sometimes the strings get knotted. And then it's tricky to move here in between. So you may see yourself as a manager, leader, and then it's not so popular among senior people, and then there are problems. Or you are kind of a leader in relationship to junior people, but if they notice that you are more like a management poodle, then you are into trouble. So you need to deal with this kind of knottiness or risk for knottiness and then move a bit more like this. So that, and in all my research, I think that we have examples of problematization and suggestion for how to come up with novel ideas and new types of research. But these are just two examples.
Thank you, Mats. Any other questions from the audience?
I raised my hand. I don't know if you have seen it.
Shoot, Ash, shoot.
Yes, I'm a PhD applicant, and I want your advice on how provocative I can be with research questions and the PhD thesis as far as getting confirmed for the dissertation and getting my first academic job afterwards. Or is it better to play it safe at the beginning, maybe until I get some publications in? Or should I wait until I get tenure, then I'm really safe? So what's your advice on like the journey itself of when to follow really provocative questions and when to play it safe?
Well, I mean, I think one should start with this immediately. Often it's too late. People tend to become more and more like into their cages over time. So I think that the best way to do this is when you are young and innocent and open and you have much more time and you are not caught in the cage. So start early, but one needs always to be a bit careful and think about what are the resources, what risks can I take? And of course, one's own like intellectual resources, background, also class background and self-confidence and intellectual skills. How much time do you have? Do you have many kids at home? And then like a tricky situation compared to can you take some extra time and take some extra risks? So what's friends? Connections, networks that you can use. I mean, there's so many things here that varies. So one can't say that this is good for everybody. It depends very much on your situation. It's also a matter of your personality. In my case, I tend always to be a bit difficult. So I'm probably intuitively perverse. I don't like to do exactly what others are doing. I think it's boring. It irritates me. I don't like too much of conformism. So I'm probably relatively good at this because of my personality disorder. I'm now joking, so I shouldn't take this too seriously. But we need to know ourselves, our inclinations, our strengths, and then sometimes we're also a bit lucky, and sometimes we are not. You can't do everything like else is in place here. And now I decide to do problematization or not. I mean, this is very much a project-defining element. So what literature do I do? What subject area am I into? And some subject areas, people are more open-minded. In others, they are quite specialized and a bit square. So it may be very difficult in some areas. It's probably more difficult in some areas of economics than in organization studies, for example.
Thank you, Mats. Mats, can I just suggest if you could stop sharing your screen? That way we can see you better.
Well, yes, stop sharing.
And then Tayo has a question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just wanted to ask, it's quite, do I need to show my face? I'm happy to.
If you don't mind.
Okay, sorry.
You can put on a mask, that's kind of in between.
I am okay, I'm happy to share my face as well. It's just not knowing. So thank you very, very much for that. Quite interesting discussion, interesting subject there. Would you say it's easier from, I am not an academic, I'm more of a practitioner. Would you say it's easier for practitioners to be more challenging in terms of being a bit more problem focused than it is? I'm looking for solutions to real life problems. And usually it tends to be the case that maybe a bit more provocative, not trying to build a career in academics, but trying to make things work and make difference in the real world.
Yeah, no, I think that it's very difficult to make generalizations. I would say that a lot of practical situations, you are constrained by the problems and then a lot of interest and issues around that, which makes that the open intellectual space that you have as an academic, that is not there often for consultants or for people working in business. So I would say that in general, academia should have much better options. And that's actually our rationale. I mean, why should we get a lot of money to academics? It should be for free thinking and coming up with new and interesting knowledge. The problem is that we tend to be disciplining ourselves and others so much so that we often fail to do this. Sometimes, of course, you can get help with interactions, academic practitioners, and then you may open up and see new aspects and so on. But on the whole, I'm not always impressed by practitioners, I must say. I think that they are even more mainstream than non-imaginative as academics. But there are a lot of exceptions, and I'm sure that you are probably.
I guess probably because unique in the sense that I don't have any. I'm not doing it from work purpose. I'm doing it in my spare time, so I could be a bit more challenged about what the practices are that we're going through. It doesn't.
Yeah, no, we need to have the free space, because what other people's thinking and so on, it tends to be quite strongly constraining us. So the free space and using the free space, but often there is this opportunities, but people tend to smolder themselves in the others are doing this, so I can't deviate. I'm so worried what they will think about me. What will be the consequences? Can I take a risk or not? Of course, there are often penalties for what we do. So if we are creative and come up with something unusual, then it may fail, it may lead to sanctions and so on, but so may the conformism. So people say that, well, I'm very creative, but I can't do that because then I won't get published. I say, well, if you are not creative in the research, it's bloody difficult to get published. So more people are probably failing because of the inability to say something new than real good efforts to say something new. So I think that's always a dilemma. And in academia, 80-90% of all work will be rejected. But crowding with people want to publish papers and so on.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Sergey?
Mats, can you share your experience in the peer review process for the research, which is based on the logic of problematization? Because essentially, what you do, you submit a paper which says that guys, all the stuff that you've written is irrelevant, and there is a great chance that some authors, whom you criticize in your manuscript, are the reviewers. So what are the tips, right? So what are the challenges? And I presume there are many challenges in the process. And can you recommend a particular journal which is more relaxed in terms of reviewing the articles on problematization?
Well, I don't know, but I mean, Academy of Management Review has published my stuff on mystery creation and assumption challenging. So in principle, that they should be open-minded, but then they tend to be very high demands, and it's always very difficult then to get something published there, and they demand very careful anchoring in early work. So they're seen as a bit strict and rigid, I would say. I mean, organization is seen as a bit lighter and more open for alternative views if you're more into half leftist or something a bit more philosophical and other stuff. Journal management inquiry is also seen as a bit more essay-oriented. So these are probably seen as a bit more open-minded and eager to do a bit more interesting work. But it varies enormously, and all kind of tribes, they have their own assumptions and own ideas and preferences. So there are no like safe outlets here, and it is bloody difficult. My own advice is then to do this as kind of carefully and credible as possible, and then there will always be, I mean, even the most cited pieces in our field, they probably would have been rejected if they had been sent at another time to another set of reviewers. So assessment is difficult, and we don't know anything for sure. But I do think it's very important then to consider the audience, imagine the audience, and they should not be too hurt, or they shouldn't perceive this as all we've done is rubbish, now you demolish everything, but see that this is how we thought about these issues before, and that kind of fine, but there are alternative views. And then if you write that in a bit more humble, provocative, but not pejorative way, where you try to take people on board. You can write we, not other people have done this, but we tend to think about these issues in that particular way. Leaders are important. Leaders, they do good things for followers. That's reasonable, but in some cases, perhaps people are not so dependent on leadership, and there are alternatives to leadership. So when leadership and when not. And then we investigate also the not leadership, or the tendency that leadership is idealized, and then it becomes very much something grandiose and a bit unrealistic, and we may need to look more carefully what is actually happening in perfect practice, and there shit happens. And then something more realistic, where people are struggling to do leadership, and people around may be quite happy if they would not do too much of all this. Perhaps. So I mean, try to reason in such a way so that people will not too much be put off, but can understand the logic and feel a bit provoked and frustrated, but not so much so they stop listen. And that is a challenge. But think what is the situation, and listen to the audience. And sometimes you can approach people that belong to the audience you work with. How do you reason? How do you respond to this? What makes you angry and provoked, and so on? What you find acceptable? Can I do this in such a way so that it's a clear provocation? And that is the ideal here. We are not just polite, but we are not too provoking, and we need to do this with quality. And I think that is the major problem. Stupid or intolerant. It's difficult to do this with such a quality so that people will accept this. And then if it's done with quality, whatever that is, sooner or later, then there will be a receptive audience.
Great. Thank you very much, Mats.
Mats, there's a question in the chat. Ellie is asking, to think differently from received wisdom in the field, a method of literature review may be important to find out taken for granted assumptions, to problematize elements of others' positions. Do you have any thought about prevalent ways of literature review? I think the prevailing way is not necessarily structured and makes it difficult to find out what is a taken for granted assumption and what is not. Use of intuition but requires timing to use intuition.
Yeah, no, I think that, I mean, the normal literature review tends to be vacuum cleaning. You should cover a lot of literature, and you should pack it in particular ways. Of course, you need to understand what they're saying and so on, but it tends to be a bit superficial and then quite accepting. As I said before, then literature review, you look at a limited number of papers or articles that are influential and novel or representative, and then you try to look very carefully and all the time ask the question, may they got something wrong here? Or what are the explicit reasoning? What are they saying? That's one level, but what are they not saying? So the assumptions, the implicit thought models, images, ideas, metaphors, or whatever, this needs to be traced. And here you need to use intuition, you need to do holistic combined with detailed readings, you need to have some perspective on what's done here. So that's quite demanding work. Of course, you can get help from people, discuss issues, you can read counter literatures. It is quite different before you start to read what you're focusing on, and then you get another mindset and another perspective or lens on all this. So different things could be done in relationship to doing this. We have this, as I said before, then the critical review published in Journal of Management Studies a couple of months ago that points at how one can do the review in a different way than the conventional one. Alvesson Sandberg, Journal of Management Studies, 2020, something.
Thank you, Matt. So there's another question from Kameshwar. He's saying, Professor, do reviewers listen to more empirical proof or respect the intuition in the argument?
Well, you need to make a credible case, and then we all use intuition in different ways. I mean, we don't know exactly how people are thinking or responding to our stuff, so we need to use then our sense of what may this mean and so on. So that's important. But you need to make a credible case. And the credible case can either be, of course, that you try to show this very clearly with logic or empirics, or people intuitively may find this relevant. So we take the example of leaders leading followers. There are two kinds of people, leaders and followers, and leaders that do the leading, or followers that tend to follow. Okay, intuitively one can say that a lot of people are not that interested in following that much, perhaps. So you can start then to problematize the notion of follower, who is following and what and when and so on. And that may be seen as a rather unconventional or marginal position that sometimes people are into, but not necessarily as like the standard way of relating to things. And we don't know for sure, but intuitively a lot of people will probably resonate with that kind of alternative assumption about followership being that kind of position rather than that kind of position in relationship to the superior leader. So sometimes then it may be read as credible because of intuition, but one needs carefully to consider how will people respond to this message. Will it resonate with their experiences? And of course, most of us are not, particularly in academia, we are not here because we love to be followers. So then we may be able then to see the value in that kind of counter assumption that followership is a rather problematic, often unwanted position rather than the natural thing people move into in the relationship with the manager or other senior actor.
Thank you, Matt. Anup has a question or two. Anup?
Thanks, Ibrat. Hi, Mats. Thanks for your lovely presentation. Two questions from me. First question, from your presentation, I gather that you could problematize either, or rather the problematization process can either be theoretically driven or it can also be phenomena driven, you know. So I was just wondering if you had examples or insights or preferences for how to approach problematization, because clearly most of the examples you shared with us were instances, at least I felt, of theory-driven problematization. And my second question would be, is problematization more or less difficult in a maturing field, or is it easier or difficult in a, say, nascent emerging field?
The last question first. I mean, in an emergent field, there still is a lot of assumptions that are more or less standard within broader areas of knowledge. So even if empirically, then it's quite new, perhaps in certain respects. There still is a lot of stuff there already. So it's not. I mean, even it's a new technology, there's a lot of technology knowledge and assumptions about all this, and assumptions about fields or innovation or whatever. So very little is new in that sense. And an emergent field is then sharing a lot of characteristics and a lot of common assumptions with other fields as well. So in that sense, I think that always struggle with this. Sometimes on particular issues, either phenomena or theory, then there may be a lot of problematization already. So a lot of people, they may have done assumption challenging already. Then of course that is a bit more tricky to add something, because people have been into this already too much or sufficiently or whatever. Then theory and phenomena, I mean, they tend to hang together, because a phenomena is always, in one sense, theory impregnated. So we don't go out there and study innovation as a phenomenon. It's always based on a theory. What is an innovation? Not product modification or just rebranding or whatever. So in that sense, and I don't think that. So theory and phenomena, they tend to hang together, but sometimes you have like an empirical observation that you can start to use as a trigger of. We did one study once on investment bankers, and we thought that they were challenged often by clients, switched clients, and by rather exploitative employees. We thought there were a lot of identity issues there. So that was the idea. But then the finding was that they were not so concerned about this. They were more interested in earning money and being adaptive and surviving and so on. So identity was not like on the agenda for them. So then we problematized the identity literature and said, well, identity, okay, that's kind of important, but it's not necessarily for everybody all the time here. So we come up then based on the problematization here that identity minimalism, and also amongst professionals. So that's more an empirical or clearly phenomena driven, but of course it goes through the theory of identity as one element in order to make it a bit more general interest. So it tends to hang together, theory and phenomena.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.